This week on Off the Air, Malcolm Moran.
Hello and welcome to Off the Air, WFUV's podcast covering some of our alumni. We're looking back and talking to some of the storied alumni of WFUV. And today we have Malcolm Moran, the founder of One on One. And so it's a very special guest for myself and Jimmy Sullivan, who I'm joined by. And Malcolm, first of all, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you reaching that far back into the alumni records to discover my whereabouts.
And of course, you graduated from Fordham and WFUV in 1975. You built up a career as a sports writer, the New York Times, USA Today, Newsday, Chicago Tribune. Now you're the director of sports capital journalism at Indiana University, Purdue in Indianapolis. First question for you is just, how is the new semester going? Obviously, we've been through a lot in the last many months. How is the new semester going in a virtual format, and how's everything on your end?
It's going very well. From an academic standpoint, I think the students have done a wonderful job adjusting to the digital reality that will serve to keep everybody safe. On the IUPUI campus, the number of positive tests has been microscopic, which is an enormous tribute to the students taking all of this as seriously as they should. And from the Sports Capital Journalism Program standpoint, I mean, there's been an interruption in our travel, but the good news for us is that in the near future, the events are going to be coming to us. I mean, the Final Four, the men's Final Four, is in Indianapolis next April. And from the discussions that have taken place, it seems clear that there's more and more confidence on the NCAA's part that the tournament will take place as scheduled. I mean, the question remains how many, if any, fans will be in attendance, but there will be media coverage, and that should be able to open some doors for our students, which we're very appreciative of. And then the following January of 22, the College Football Playoff National Championship is going to be at Lucas Oil Stadium in Indianapolis, which I've been looking forward to since the nanosecond that it was announced, because our students have covered football championship games going back to the BCS era. So in terms of the academic piece and the program's opportunities, things have really been going very well.
Malcolm, just one more on that front. You were talking about going out and covering events, and I see your program all the time on Twitter publicizing the things you're covering, whether it be college football, college basketball, other sports as well. How much do you and the students miss being at the events? Because I think one thing that both Chris and I can attest to in covering games and covering local sports teams is that there's really nothing quite like being there. And I think we've really gotten that appreciation now that it's been over 6 months that we really haven't been able to cover things. So how much do you miss that personal experience?
I do miss it, although given the timing of the events that we have traditionally covered in the nearly 8 years that I've been here, most of them fall during the spring semester. I mean, there isn't that much going on in the fall that we cover as a program. Now, I mean, I've had a class cover WNBA games virtually. We've covered the Colts virtually. I suspect we'll cover the national championship game virtually. But it really hasn't hit us yet for this year. Now, it was difficult for us in March because when everything came to a screeching halt, we had just covered the NFL scouting combine in person. The Horizon League men's tournament, the Horizon League women's tournament. We were in the process of starting to cover we had covered the Big Ten women's tournament, and then the Big Ten men's tournament got through the one night before everything was shut down. And so in the remainder of March, we were scheduled to cover the remainder of the Big Ten men's tournament. There was going to be a regional of the NCAA men in Indianapolis. And that same week, the NCAA men's swimming and diving championships were going to be at the natatorium on our campus. And then the Final Four. So there was all this just about to happen that obviously had to be canceled for understandable reasons. And so that was a big disappointment for the students that were getting ready to do that. And, really all you can do is be prepared for whatever opportunity is going to present itself, whether it's virtual or in person, and just hope that everybody can stay healthy and get through this and then adjust to whatever the new normal is whenever it happens.
And we've seen so much change here at WFUV. Of course, we're not in the radio station right now. We're recording remotely. And I want to jump back to WFUV and go back to its earliest moments, the founding of One-on-One, which was your brainchild. And it was initially thought up 10 minutes high school sports, 10 minutes college sports, 10 minutes pro sports, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, it's evolved to become what it is today. And we're still going through some evolutions. But if you could take us back to that time and the earliest days of One-on-One, when you were the sports director at WFUV, your thoughts behind it, your vision for it, and what it's become.
Well, first of all, I'm a little relieved because when you said you wanted to take me back to the earliest days, I thought you were going to ask me what it was like to be classmates with Vin Scully in the late 40s. and I was beginning to get a little nervous. But one element that has been overlooked, and I've done my best to talk about it in the past, particularly when Bob Aarons was responsible for setting up that wonderful 40th anniversary dinner. Hard to believe it was 6 years ago. But the one key part of the evolution that really can't get enough credit is that in the 1972-73 academic year, Tom Sabella was the sports director. And the imprint that he put on the sports department that year, which really lasts to this day, is that he created a point of emphasis that this is a journalism operation. I mean, yes, we're broadcasting sporting events, but we're doing it from a perspective of being journalists. And what that accomplished for the department is that and I had the perspective of just being a staff member in those days, but that allowed the department to heighten its credibility within the entire station operation, so that we weren't just merely doing games anymore. Obviously, that's an important part, but it allowed us to begin the discussion about expanding into different possibilities that would create opportunities for a wider range of students in the sports department. And so in the following year, after Tom departed, when I became sports director, that's when we started talking about a program on Sunday nights that was part pro sports, part college sports, part high school sports. And that really opened the door for getting credentials for pro sporting events. I mean, that was the genesis of that initiative. And what that demonstrated was that we could be accountable for delivering a quality product that we all took seriously over a period of however many weeks it was. And then the success of that program, which was completely different from a call-in show, but it demonstrated our responsibility and our accountability. And then that led to the discussion of having a weekly call-in show.
Malcolm, talking about one-on-one itself, the success of the show, you went ahead and created it. Obviously, as Chris said, there have been a lot of evolutions. What it started out as being is different from what it is now. But was there a particular moment, a particular point in time where you came to the realization that one-on-one was going to be something special, that you had helped create something that was really important and that could really succeed in New York?
I don't think that hit me when I was still there, because we were just concentrating on getting to the next week, and then the week after that, and then the week after that. I mean, what kind of guests can we get? What topic should we be talking about? I mean, how can we do this better? Because there weren't that many templates that had been in place. I mean, the reason that we can say that it's the longest running is because for whatever reason in that market, there was a lull in the mid-'70s, and we were the only talk show. There had been a bunch of them that came earlier and were done very well. I mean, WNBC really created the genre. And Bill Mazer, who a lot of New Yorkers remember fondly, he basically invented the genre in New York City in the mid-'60s. And one of the things that he established that became part of what we were trying to accomplish with one-on-one is that it really was a two-way conversation. For whatever reason, things developed over time where I'm sure you've heard this plenty of times, and it drives me crazy when you'll hear a caller ask a question and say, well, I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Well, that's not what this is about. I mean, this is about a respectful give and take. And in New York, that started with Bill Mazer. In the late 60s and early 70s, you had people like Guy Manella at WBZ in Boston, a 50,000 watt operation, which a high school kid could get in Queens. And I mean, not that I was rooting for the Red Sox or the Bruins or the Celtics and the Patriots didn't count in those days. I mean, they were a non-entity. But it was the same respectful give and take. And then in the early 70s, Marty Glickman actually, for a brief period of time, had a call-in show on WNEW AM 1130. And he really took that relationship to a new level. And the irony is that much later, with Bob Aarons being the conduit, Marty became an enormous influence on any number of staffers that passed through and worked at FUV. Well, he was impacting the product before he even knew it, because his willingness, even if he wasn't necessarily in agreement with a caller on issue X, he established a culture in that show of a respectful give and take. And that's what we borrowed. If you'd like to use the word steal, I would plead guilty. But that's the philosophy that we borrowed from Marty's show on WNEW AM. And one of the things I mentioned at that dinner in 2014 is that the thing that I may be most proud of, and I can say this because I can't take any credit for anything that happened after my graduation, but with all the changes and with all of the different people to have the chance to sit in that chair over the years, that respectful, professional feeling has endured all this time. And I think that's a tribute to every single host that's ever been involved with this over the years. And it's something, particularly now, when it just seems like a media philosophy is that you need to be as shrill as possible to be heard over the din, and to have people in the early stage of their development embrace what could easily be dismissed as an old school approach, which I don't use the word old school, I prefer to call it timeless. Like, unfortunately, in too many areas of our country, I'm not trying to get political here, but the absence of an honest give and take has really been felt acutely in a lot of different ways. And one-on-one in our little corner of the world has preserved the idea of civility, and I'm very, very proud of that.
And we all appreciate that, because that we're indebted to those who brought it in and who nourished it, and we hope that we continue to nourish it today. That professionalism on the air, and that this isn't necessarily about being shrill. You mentioned journalism as an element of the program that's important, that's emphasized, and that that journalism is a part of the work that we do. How important is that as someone who teaches journalism? What's the distinction between simply getting on the radio and talking versus having the interrogating and the questioning involved in good journalism that you can integrate into sports talk or sports calling? How important is that?
Well, it's essential. And I'll tell you, to be frank, I don't listen to very much sports talk radio anymore, precisely for that reason. I mean, I'm not trying to embarrass anybody specifically, but I can recall sitting at a stoplight, this is years ago, and it was during a period of time when not much was going on. And to me, that's when you really test the creativity and the initiative of somebody hosting a sports talk show, when there aren't obvious things to talk about, when you don't have a big event going on or right in front of you. And so I'm listening to this program, and I'm at a red light, and the segment is being devoted to the host is soliciting stories from callers to describe when they went to a game or an event and they got so drunk that they passed out. And there's story after story of, like, I went to this game, I went to that game, and my buddies told me, like, I was, blah, 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 and people are laughing about it. And maybe I realized, I was outraged. And I realized after the fact that maybe part of that reason is having worked on 2 different campuses and understanding how alcohol use and overuse has become an enormous issue on college campuses in this country, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years that I've been on the academic side. And to be so cavalier about it and to make it into this joke just to get through a segment, I just said, I've got better things to listen to. And I hit the button for E Street Radio. And for that show in particular, I've never looked back. And so to answer the question specifically, I think no matter what form of communication you're involved with, whether you're speaking in a broadcast capacity or whether you're working on a 3,000-word story that you've taken a month to polish, you have the same responsibility to be as accurate and as fair, and those are 2 different things. You can be accurate without being fair. You can quote somebody accurately, but you can portray the tone of it in a way that's unfair to the person being quoted. And so to me, it's essential. And I realized I didn't completely answer the earlier question about when it hit me in terms of the success of the show. And what I can tell you is this was after I had been working at the New York Times for several years. And by this time, the show had been on the air for about a decade. And I'm in the office one day chatting with an editor, and he said, "You went to Fordham, right?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I was listening to this show last night. I mean, this sports talk show, and I mean, those kids at Fordham are really good. You ever listen to that show?" And for whatever reason, I just said, "Oh yeah." I mean, I felt like I'd be showing them up if I said, "Well, by the way," I was the first one to host it. So all I said was, "No, yeah, I mean, no, you're right. I mean, they do a great job." And, and I think that's when it hit me where, here's a professional in the industry, and he was basically a fan of what was going on there. So that's probably when I began to realize that this thing not only has legs, but it's really gained a lot of a foothold in the biggest market in the country.
That's a great story you tell about your editor telling you that. I wanted to ask you personally, I read an article about you in Fordham News a few months back, and they were talking about, or you were talking about actually, how much you fell in love with college basketball in high school and college. You're still a big college basketball fan, and you were specifically talking about the Digger Phelps Fordham team in the early 70s. How much did that team in particular, and Fordham basketball in general, catalyze your love of the sport that obviously you still have to this day?
It's impossible to fully describe in what clearly was a prehistoric era in the history of the sport. This was 8 years before the formation of the Big East Conference, when Eastern schools were just independents. If on a given Saturday afternoon, if you had a chance to watch 3 basketball games on television, that was like a bonanza. I mean, there would be the ECAC game of the week, which occasionally would be from the Rose Hill Gym. Maybe there would be a syndicated national game with highly ranked teams. And if we really got lucky, you'd be able to see maybe Columbia's playing at home and might be on Channel 11 in the evening. I mean, that was a full day. And so to try to describe how a team that had been 10-15 the year before, for a period of 3 to 4 weeks from early February to the start of the NCAA tournament, took over New York City. I mean, Howard Cosell was talking about the Rams all the time. There were consecutive sellouts in the Garden on Thursday nights, February 18 and February 25. On the 18th, they're playing Notre Dame and Austin Carr, which had beaten UCLA earlier that season. This is when UCLA was in the midst of 10 championships in 12 years. I tried to get in and was turned away. The next week, Marquette, with Al McGuire as coach, comes in. I didn't even try to get a ticket to that game because it was such an impossible ticket. And this is what got my attention. There was so much interest in that game that Marv Albert, then the radio voice of the Knicks, was delivering play-by-play on WNBC. So I was going back and forth from WFUV, which I had listened to all season long, to listening Marv, doing the Rams on WNBC. And it was just, it was a very powerful time. And here you have this young first-year head coach who understood the value of the media. And he had in the New York media, basically in the palm of his hand. And then they get into the tournament. They win a game. They get to the round of 16. They lose to Villanova, which wound up getting to the Final Four. And then in early May, I come home from school one day, and in those days, Marv did the afternoon sports reports on WNBC. And one day in early May, he started his report by saying, as expected, Fordham coach Digger Phelps announced today, blah, blah, blah. And I sat in front of the radio saying, as expected, let me tell you what I expected. I expected that in my 4 years, I'm going to get to the Final Four, and that may not be happening anymore. So, I mean, it was just, and that's why it was such a painful divorce. And after, I mean, Digger, became a friend of mine and was a huge help to me professionally much later on. And seeing what he accomplished at Notre Dame, not just in terms of achievement on the floor, but what his teams represented academically. I mean, just taking the high road in every way. And I couldn't blame him for leaving, but I mean, it was just a very passionate time in many, many ways.
Over the years, Malcolm, you've been to 37 Final Fours, 11 Super Bowls, 16 World Series, 4 Olympic Games, having credentials to some of the biggest stages in sports across the world for so many years now. Maybe I'm dealing in a generality, but what's that like? What have you accrued in just being a part, being eyes and ears next to some of the biggest events that define culture, that in a lot of ways define American culture?
It's a great question. And probably the biggest thing I've learned, and I get some strange looks when I mention this in class, so feel free to look at me like I'm from Mars. But seriously, the thing I've learned is if you can cover a high school football game, you can cover a Super Bowl. If you can cover a high school basketball game, you can cover the Final Four or the NBA championships or the gold medal game, men or women, in the Olympics. And the reason I say that is because at the high school level, depending on the facility, depending on the resources, depending on whether the Wi-Fi works, you may have all these obstacles thrown in front of you, and your problem-solving skills could be stressed. Well, it might not seem like it when you're watching events, big-time events like that on TV, but when you go to the Olympics, it's not the seamless, Bob Costas throwing it to track and field, and everything is neat and orderly and seamless. Well, that's because there are dozens, if not hundreds, of people doing a specific job, and you've got brilliant people in charge that create this remarkable quilt. If you're covering the Olympics by yourself, you're worried about things like, is the media shuttle going to get me where I need to go on time? Or it's 10 o'clock at night and I haven't had anything to eat since breakfast because there hasn't been any time. Can I get my hands on a hot dog? Which, when you're at the London Olympics, there aren't a lot of hot dogs. There's a lot of fish and chips, but not many hot dogs. So, sorry about the long-winded answer, but the problem-solving skills that you develop covering Pee-wee hockey, it could be anything, are transferable to covering something that's on the big stage. And one of the most fun things for me, and I could just cite London or Rio as examples, is watching really committed and talented students transform themselves. And what I mean is, like, when you first get to London and all, the city is spectacular and the Olympics are going to start in 3 days and, all the flags are flying and you're thinking, Like, I'm at the Olympics. Like, what do I do now? And to get from that wide-eyed, what do I do next kind of feeling to watching them just focus on the next thing and just kind of lock into the routine. And then, oh, by the way, overcome the fatigue factor, which is gigantic. I mean, I remember in both cases telling students, here's what's going to happen. Our adrenaline is going to get us about halfway through the first week, and we're going to be flying. And then after that, we're going to be grinding, because you're basically you're getting on a media shuttle anywhere from 9 to 10 a.m. and you're coming back on a media shuttle anywhere from 1:30 to 3 a.m. Now, I know you guys, in a pinch, you could handle those hours, but 17 straight days of that is something else. And to see people that are in the early stage of their development just grind it out and work through that exhaustion and make the extra effort to make sure that they're not misspelling a name or making a grammatical error or just some silly fatigue-driven mistake, to work through all that really has been inspiring.
So, Malcolm, it's interesting you bring that up about students maybe going to the Olympics or the Final Four or the Super Bowl, and at first being wide-eyed and then realizing, okay, there's a job to be done, I belong here, so on and so forth. We at FUV have had somewhat of a similar experience at times when we're covering big events, where sometimes you'll get that initial sense and then it sinks in, you have a job to do, and then you treat it professionally. You guys cover a lot of big events as well at IUPUI, whether it's the Final Four or the Big Ten championship game, Big Ten tournament in basketball, stuff like that. How crucial is that for students in college, for example, to get that experience early on in their development, to have a big event, get that, kind of wide-eyed sense of things, and then realize that there's a job to do and be able to go out and do it, like you said?
Well, first of all, it helps them get jobs, because inevitably in almost any event of that size, there's going to be some logistical challenge or some obstacle that the student had to overcome. And sometimes it might be with my help, sometimes it might just be on their own, just left to their own resources in a crazy post-game situation. Well, that has value on a bunch of different levels. One of the levels is that when they're interviewing for that really competitive internship or an entry-level job they really want, editors and producers love to ask, describe some kind of challenge that you've had to overcome. Well, if the challenge you're describing happened at the Olympic Games and you're 22 or 23 years old and you overcame it and kept your cool and delivered a story on deadline, that's going to get an editor or a producer's attention. But beyond that part of it, I mean, I can give you an example of Emily Kaplan, who was an outstanding student at Penn State when I was there, who now is at ESPN, just had her experience in the bubble at Edmonton in the NHL Conference Championships and then the Stanley Cup Finals. And she was one of the students in London. And after graduation, when the Super Bowl was in New York, she was there. And so she sent me a picture from Media Day and texted it to me, and I replied, hey, good luck with this, file early and often, and I hope it's a great week. I'd love to hear all about it when it's all over. And then later on, when we had a chance to talk, she said, nothing that has happened here has overwhelmed me because of London. And just for one thing, it made me feel even better about the London experience because there was a lasting boost of confidence. When you have to go through, which can, the type of event that can be overwhelming, especially if you haven't done it before, and then move on to another event and feel like, I can do this. I mean, I've done something at least as big as this. I mean, that you can't put a price or a value on the boost in confidence that creates, which ultimately is why I do what I do. I mean, yes, don't get me wrong. I mean, it was great to be in London for all kinds of reasons and to be there, but to be able to provide an opportunity that kind of catapults a graduate into the industry with that level of deserved confidence, I mean, it's an important part of what we do here.
If I'd ask one more of you, Malcolm, you spent a lot of time at the New York Times, and to us as journalists, sort of the gold standard of at least in print journalism. And we sort of live in a time where even that is questioned right now. What did you glean at a place specifically like the New York Times and all the places that you've been about staying hard to the truth and absorbing a culture of just journalistic integrity that we all aspire to?
It's the sense of responsibility. I mean, that drives you as much as anything else, and that's why to see in some quarters that come under attack, I mean, frankly, I find it infuriating. I mean, I think, and I'm speaking as somebody from the academy now who is no longer in the industry day to day, I think one day when we look back on this period, it is going to be viewed as one of journalism's finest hours for the volume of intense stories, one behind the other, that have unfolded before our eyes in real time, and the pressure to deliver that information on a minute-by-minute basis. I mean, just the stress and the sense of responsibility must be overwhelming. I mean, I have a friend who has worked in journalism in Washington on news side for a long time, and just from conversations we've had, it became clear a while ago that people there were fried then, just from like the day-to-day stress of so many developments unfolding so quickly, and that was before you introduce a global crisis on top of it. So I really do think we're going to look back on the quality of the work and the stress that it's being produced under, and just think about a remarkable time.
Thank you so much, and for your insight, and that I believe the same, and it's wonderful to see people carrying this work forward at a time like this. Malcolm Moran, Director of Sports Capital Journalism at IUPUI, the FUV alum from 1975, and the founder of One on One. We thank you so much for joining us and taking the time with us on the Off the Air podcast.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for continuing a tradition way beyond what any of us ever imagined.
Thanks, Malcolm.
Thank you.